Okay, so before we hop in and start doing any coding, let's try and first gain a basic understanding about what the Assistants API is and how it differs from the other APIs that OpenAI offers. Before we start, it's also important to note that this is currently in beta, so that means that things might change slightly before the official release, and also we could expect more features to come out that aren't currently included in this beta version. And in terms of what is the Assistants API, so if I had to really summarize it in a very, very simple manner, it is basically like chat completions plus tools plus storage. So basically what OpenAI has done is taken a bunch of the things that you might have otherwise gone to external tools for, such as analyzing documents and reading files, as well as vector storage, and taken all that and bundled it into one offering along with its chat completions models, and that is the Assistants API. And essentially, it is conversation based, so it's also based on a certain kind of message-like interaction, very much like chat completions, but there's a completely different way for how the messages are created and retrieved, and we're going to talk about all of that. And I think now is a good point to go ahead and break down what the different parts of this Assistant API are. So in order to understand the different aspects of the Assistant API, I think the documentation is a great place to start. Obviously, I won't read it word for word, but I will follow through here with the steps that OpenAI provides in terms of getting started with Assistants API. And the first step is, of course, to create the assistant. And you can do this in two ways. So you can do this either through an API endpoint. So if you head over to the API reference and you look inside of the docs for the assistant section here, then you have one endpoint, which is create assistant. So you can essentially make a call to an API and create one of these assistants. Another option would be to go to your dashboard for your OpenAI account, and you have an interface here as well for creating an assistant, uploading files, etc. And we're going to look at it in depth in a moment. The difference between these is really if you're planning on having, in my view, one assistant, or if you're planning on having multiple assistants that you essentially allow each user to create their own unique assistants. So for example, if you're a business and you're just trying to provide people with an assistant with information, let's say, about your business, and each user interaction is going to be the same with the same information, then I would probably just head over here to the interface and get it set up here because it's much simpler. But if you need to provide a unique experience for each user and have different data that's associated with different users that really affects how that assistant operates, then you're going to be using this create assistant endpoint. So I'm not going to be touching on this endpoint specifically in this tutorial because I think that it's a slightly more advanced use case that doesn't apply to most of the viewers, I'm guessing. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, and we can kind of make a completion tutorial about that. But for now, we're going to be creating our assistant here through this interface. But essentially, in step one, we're creating this assistant, which what is an assistant? It's kind of like a fine-tuned model of one of the chat completions endpoints. So like it's kind of your own GPT-4, you can think of it like, that you provide your own context and tools to. And tools is really where it gets that level up above chat completions, because chat completions you can also give context. So you can go ahead and provide, system instructions and stuff like that. And if you're not familiar with the chat completions endpoint, I highly recommend watching the first video in this series, which kind of gives a review of that, because that's really the basis for OpenAI at this point. So really the step up here is that you're kind of bundling these instructions and tools all into one specific assistant that has a purpose, okay, as opposed to using a generic model that OpenAI provides. And after you've created your assistant, you can go ahead and create a thread. So a thread you can think of as a specific instance or interaction with this assistant. So if you think about, let's say, ChatGPT, So one conversation with ChatGPT would be a thread. And it could be that one user has multiple threads, and it could be that you have different threads that are associated with different users, and each one of these is essentially a conversation. Okay, so that's going to be the next step that we're going to tackle. And then we're going to be adding messages to a thread. So there are two people that can add messages to the thread, the user and the AI. And here we're talking about the user. So essentially we're going to provide the thread with some kind of input from the user and create a message. After we provide that message, we can do something which is a run. So we're going to run the assistant, and the assistant is going to respond to those user messages based on whatever instructions, criteria, tools it has been given. And the difference, one of the key differences here between this and chat completions is that after you run the assistant, you're not going to immediately get back a message, but what's going to happen is that after the run is complete, you're going to have to retrieve the entire thread, which will contain all of the messages, including the additional messages that the AI has generated. Okay, so that's one of the differences here between chat completions and this assistant. And that's what we're going to be taking a look at now. So we'll understand it more in depth if that wasn't 100% clear to you at the moment. And that's the overview. So now what we're going to do is we're going to head in and start to create our first assistant. Okay, so as I said, we are going to start here inside of our OpenAI dashboard. And to get to this point, you're going to need to have an OpenAI account, and then just head over to platform.openai.com/assistants, or you can probably just find it here in the side panel right under Playground. You have assistants over here. And to create your assistant, it's pretty straightforward. You just go over here and click Create. And I'm going to name my assistant Wix Demo. And I'm going to be creating an assistant which can answer questions about Wix's financial reports. Okay, so not a very fascinating thing, but I had to find some PDFs that were unique and that was easy to access and of slight interest to our audience. So what I'm going to do here is just give the instructions that answer the user's questions based on the Wix financial reports. Okay? And here, obviously, you're going to put whatever instructions are relevant to your specific assistant. And then we're going to go ahead and pick a model. And just note that not all the models allow all of the things here. So for example, if we want retrieval, then we can't use GPT-4 because then you see here retrieval is kind of blocked out. But we'll have to use GPT-4 preview. And I'm going to go ahead and turn retrieval on. One thing to note here is that you definitely want to look up the information about pricing. And I'm not going to mention the pricing right now because that might be something that can change also, and everybody should look up pricing for themselves. But the pricing for assistants works differently than the other API endpoints and models of OpenAI, because essentially what they're doing is they're storing files for you and they're storing information from the threads, and everything is persisted. So it's kind of like you're paying for storage as well. So the second that you turn on this retrieval and you use this assistant, then you incur some daily fees, if I'm not mistaken. Again, please go look up your own information about pricing before you do anything. But just note here, as you turn this on, you are likely incurring some kind of fee. And then you can go over here and add the files. So I'm just going to upload from my computer the different PDFs. Okay, so I have shareholder update second quarter. I have shareholder update third quarter and second quarter and results. Basically just a bunch of PDFs that I downloaded from the Wix website. And I'm going to go ahead and click Save. And boom, so my assistant was created, and that's really awesome. And if you want, you can go ahead here and click Test, and that will take you to the playground where essentially you can begin to interact with this assistant. So what we're going to be doing on our Wix website is trying to replicate this experience that we have here in the playground and give the user those same capabilities inside of our Wix website. So just for example, here in the playground, let's send it a message. So compare the second and third quarters of 2023. I wonder if it'll already understand that we're talking about Wix. That's what I'm trying to see here. Also kind of curious to see what it says. And so here you can see the thread number. So basically, if we wanted, we could technically take this specific thread and hard code it into our Wix side if we wanted to interact with this specific thread that we have here. This is our assistant ID over here. Okay, so this is pretty cool. So it already understood the context, so it understood that I'm talking about Wix, and it gave me information, I'm quite sure, pretty much from the docs. And you can see that here because there's also some sources over here. So this is the experience that we were going for, and this is what we're trying to implement on our Wix website. So now what we're going to do is we're going to head over to our site and begin adding some code that will allow us to interact with this assistant that we just created. So here I am on our Wix website, and as I said, what we're going to be doing now is implementing an interface to interact with the assistant that we've already created on OpenAI from our Wix website. And to do that, I have this playground page set up. This is our playground, not the OpenAI playground. And we basically just have an input here and then some outputs to display what the user sent and what the AI has generated. In terms of code on this page, so we have some code that we have created earlier. So if you don't really understand how this code is working and you want a refresher, then you can check out the first video of this tutorial where we kind of did a refresher for the chat completions endpoint. And that's where we built this function here, which basically just asks a question to the AI. Obviously, we're going to need to make some changes here in terms of how that interaction happens with the backend code. But in terms of what we want to happen from the UI on the front end, it's going to be pretty similar, like in terms of what we expand and collapse and showing loading and stuff like that. And that's why I'm just going to preserve this function here for now. In order to handle all of the interactions with the API, I'm going to create a new backend file. And this is where most of the magic is going to be happening. And I'm just going to call it assistant.jsw. Okay, so pretty simple. And here we're going to be writing all of the code for interaction with our assistant. So let me just close this and zoom in a little bit so you can see everything a little better. Give it 1, 2, 3. Awesome. So this is where we're going to be doing all of our code writing. Let me just clear this file so that we have nothing inside. So now that we're ready to write some code, first I'm going to import those modules that we know that we're going to need, such as fetch and Wix secrets. Import get secret from Wix secret backend. This is stuff that we know that we're going to need. And I'm going to create a function. And this function is going to be interacting with the threads endpoint. So let me just pop over here and show you why. So if we take a look at the documentation for the assistants, you can see that it's broken down into 4 parts. So the first part here is assistants. And this is these are all of the API endpoints for creating an assistant, retrieving the assistant, modifying assistant, etc., etc. Since we've already created our assistant in the OpenAI interface, we don't really need this endpoint at the moment. This will mostly be useful to you if you have the need to generate multiple assistants for multiple users. So that's where you're going to be looking here at the documentation. And we're going to be starting off right over here in the threads part. And the first step, once we already have our assistant built, is to create a thread. And one thing that's important to note is that these threads, from what I can tell here in the documentation, are not automatically linked with a specific assistant. So you could think of threads as one thing, assistants as another thing, and you can choose to combine them together in different ways so that the assistant can run on a specific thread. And we'll see how that works in a moment. So let's start off by creating our first thread. So that's going to be here, this create thread endpoint. And I'm just going to grab the endpoint URL right over here. And I'm going to create a function. So it's going to be export async function create thread. And at the moment, this is not going to take any parameters. And I'm just going to throw the endpoint in here. So const endpoint is going to be equal to this endpoint that we just copied over. Next thing we know we're definitely going to need is that API key. So let's get that from our secrets backend. So it's going to be get secret OpenAI API key. And this is what I named my API key. Your API key might be named something else. So you're obviously going to want to use whatever your name is over here. Next thing we're going to do is set up the options. So let's have here const options. And we know that the method is post. And we know that because it says right over here post. And take note, because not all of these endpoints for the assistants are going to be post. So from my experience until now, OpenAI has been mostly post requests, but here inside of the Assistants API, we do have some GET requests. So do note and make sure that you're using the correct method here for your different API calls. The next thing that we're going to need here are these headers. Let me just copy all three of these headers over, and we'll declare headers and put these right in here. We're going to need to do some light editing to turn it from curl into fetch. So let's get rid of that, get rid of that, and almost done. This will turn into a template literal so that it can take our API key. And get rid of these and add commas. There we go. So what do we have here? No, sorry, this needs to be API key. Okay, so we have our content type, application/JSON. We have authorization where we send through our API key. And we have this additional header which indicates that this is beta assistance version 1. This is something that I imagine might change in the future. So depending on when you're watching this tutorial, this line may have been updated or irrelevant. So double check the documentation to make sure this is relevant if you're watching it sometime after December of 2023. And the last thing that we're going to need here as well is a body, but it's an empty body. So if we take a look here, we can see here that there's a body and it's just an empty string. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add in a body here, and it's going to be json.stringify, and I'm just going to send in an empty object like that. Cool. So this is looking pretty good. And let's do const response equals to await fetch endpoint and options. And then we'll get the data from the response. So const data equals await response JSON, and we'll return that data. And that should be enough to create a thread. So let's give it a spin. I'm going to click play and run. And we got back our thread. Okay, so now we've created a thread. And again, you've noticed that we didn't pass in any information here with regard to our assistant. So this thread doesn't know about our assistant, doesn't know what our assistant is, and it's currently an empty thread. So the next step that we're going to take is to add messages to this thread. So let me copy over this thread ID. And I might need to copy this entire JSON over here. And I'm going to paste this over here just so that I can grab this thread ID. Try and grab that thread ID. And I'm just going to keep it as a note here so that I can use it to pass into our future functions that we're going to create. Obviously, when we integrate this with our front end, this whole thing will be streamlined into a process, and we'll store this thread ID in a variable somewhere. And basically, this thread represents a conversation. So whenever our user starts a new conversation with the assistant and we want to kind of clear all of the history, then we can create a new thread. And we could also log these different threads so that if somebody wants to, let's say, jump between two different conversations, we can allow them to kind of restore a previous conversation. And we don't need to handle the storage of conversation histories anymore because OpenAI is handling all of the storage. So that's what these threads are. And as I said, the next step, we're going to be adding a message to the thread. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function. So let's say export async function, and this will be create message. And this create message function is going to take the thread ID, and it's going to use an endpoint, which is create message. Okay, so this is also post. And here we have the URL, and we'll notice something again here that's quite unique to the Assistants API once it comes to OpenAI. Let me just declare the variable here, endpoint. And I'm going to put this in a template literal, and you'll see in a second why, because you can see here that we have a variable. Okay, so here we actually have a parameter that's passed in through the URL, and that's the thread ID. So this endpoint needs to be dynamic based on whichever thread ID we are creating this message for. So that's how we pass it in over there. And in terms of the rest, so what we have here, the headers are quite similar. And then we pass in the actual request body, which includes the role. Okay, so now this can only be user at the moment. And this is very different than what we experienced with chat completions. So with chat completions, we passed in an array of messages, which included system instructions, which included user messages and the assistant messages from the history. And now all we have to deal with is providing the user messages because the system instructions were provided to the assistant when we created the assistant, and the assistant messages are created or appended to the thread automatically when we run the assistant. So at the moment, we just need to add in the user messages. And in terms of file IDs, so to my understanding, these are additional files that you want to use as context for this specific message, as opposed to the files that we uploaded to the assistant, which give the assistant general context for answering all of its inquiries. Okay, so these file IDs are, you can think of it as files for that you want to allow the user to upload along with a message. So we're not going to deal with that right now because uploading files to OpenAI is a whole another project. But we're just going to deal with these basic parameters, which is role and content. So let's go over here. And what I'm going to do to simplify things, because these headers are going to be pretty much the same for all of our APIs, essentially. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a function that's going to be just like a helper function. So function, we can make it even, yeah, we'll just make it a regular function, and I'll call it get headers. And we'll pass in the API key, and we'll have it return these headers. Okay, so I'm going to put this over here, return. This is just to make our code just a little more dry. So here what we're going to have is get headers, and we'll pass in the API key. And then we can do the same thing over here. So we can have the options const options equals 2. And for this, we also have the same method, which is going to be post. We have our headers, which is again get headers API key, which reminds me that we need to also get the API key here in this function over there. And last but not least, we have our body. And here we actually do have a body, so that's JSON.stringify. And here we're going to have the actual message. and that's going to have the role and content. And the role is always going to be user. And the content is going to be whatever content we want to put in with the message. So here we can have the content, and we can just determine that dynamically whenever we're creating a message. Last but not least, we're going to run fetch, and that's going to be exactly the same as the previous function. Let's go and run that. And let's test it out. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy over this thread ID. Basically, this message that we're creating now is going to be appended to this thread. Okay, so let's go ahead and run create message. So I'm first put in here the thread ID, and let's add the content. Hi, how are you? Okay, so let's go ahead and click run. And we got an error. So missing bear or basic authentication in header. Okay, that means something wrong with passing in the API key. Okay, so like it is 90% of the time, the problem was a typo. So for some reason, I accidentally get headers over here instead of headers. So that's that. And let me get rid of this log that I used for my debugging. And let's run this again. So let me copy over the thread and export this. Oh, good, we already have it over here, so I don't need it. And I'm going to click run. And now we got back this message. Okay, so we have the message ID, we have the contents, and all is good. So now we have a thread with a message. Now what I want to do is I want to be able to retrieve all of the messages on a specific thread after we've added a message to it. And this is also going to be useful later on for after we actually run our assistant, and then we want to get all the messages, including the assistant's message. So let's head over to our reference, and we see that we have here retrieve message, and we also have this option here, list messages. Okay, and you can see this is a GET request. Like I said, some of these are GET requests, and this gives a list of messages for a given thread. Okay, so let's create a new function. I'll copy over this endpoint, and we're going to create a new function here above get message, sorry, and I'm going to call it export async function list messages. And here we're going to have a thread ID and const endpoint equals to, and let me paste this in again as a template literal. And here, instead of thread underscore ID, I'm just going to put the parameter that I passed into the function, which is thread ID. Awesome. And the rest is going to be pretty much the same as create thread. So if we take a look over here, we don't really have any other body parameters. We do have some optional query parameters, and that's because this is a GET request, so we can't really provide a body to a GET request, but we can provide query parameters. And these optional parameters are limit, so how many messages we actually want to return. So let's say we only want to display the last 10 messages to the user, so we'd limit that, let's say, to 10. And the default is 20. I'll just leave it at the default for now. Order, so how we want to get the messages in terms of order. So do we want the latest one first or the earliest one first? And this is sort order by created at. So it defaults to descending, which we'll see what that means. I'm hoping that means that the earliest one is first and the latest one is last, because that is most likely what you would want. But we'll see. After and before, I'm not going to dive into those because they look a little complicated and they're optional. So if you're interested in what that is, you can go ahead and read the documentation. But for now, I'm just going to get a basic list of all the messages with all the defaults. So here we are, and I'm going to copy over this code here. And whenever you're copying a large bulk of code like this, it's usually an indication that it probably could be made more efficient in a refactoring stage, but we're not in the refactoring stage right now. So I'm just going to copy this over and put it right over there. And now I'm going to list the messages from this thread. So let me close this and run this list messages function. Put that right over there. Hit run. And I already know that I think I'm going to have an error. And this is obviously punishing me for copying and pasting code. But the error is, there's a few errors, but they're probably all stemming from one thing, and that is that I didn't change this to the get method, even though I warned you in the beginning that's the get method. So let me try running that again like that. And there we go. Okay, so we got the list and we got the data, which is an array, makes sense. And we have the one message that has been appended to our thread, okay, from the user. And after we run our assistant, we are going to be able to see the messages from the assistant as well. So let's start talking about how we're going to run that assistant. So I'm going to create a new function. So export async function. And let's call it run assistant. And let's see what parameters we need here in order to run the assistant. So I'm going to go over here to run, and I'm going to do create run. And in terms of the headers, surprise, it's very similar. The endpoint is different, of course. Let me just copy over this endpoint and paste it right over here. And from what I saw, it also has params in it. So let me create a template literal. And we're going to need their thread ID. So let's pass in thread ID and change this also to be thread ID as we have written. Okay, so that's one thing that we know that we need. The rest we saw is very similar. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to copy over this as kind of a starter point. And body is obviously going to be different. So let me get rid of this before I accidentally confuse myself. So we have a very simple post request here with an empty body for now. Okay, so let's see what we need to pass in, if anything at all, for the body. So the request body is going to take the assistant ID. Okay, so let me copy that over here. And we'll also need to pass an assistant ID into the params. And in terms of actually getting that assistant ID, so we can go over here to our assistants, and you can see that the ID is right over here. And if I open it up, it's also right over here. So this is the assistant ID. And if you only have one assistant on your site, so essentially you can just store this ID, let's say, as a secret in the secret manager and retrieve that. And you don't need to pass it in as a parameter per se, because you don't need that level of kind of dynamism. You don't need it to be that dynamic. So I'm actually going to do something similar. I'll just copy it over. I'll make it a global variable. So const assistant ID, and I'll paste it right over there. Whoops. And I'll paste it right over there. And now we have that, and I can just go ahead and put that right over here. Okay, so we don't need to pass it in here as an argument. We could just leave it like this. Again, if you have multiple assistants, then you're going to need to make that more dynamic. So that is the assistant ID. Let's see if there's anything else we need. Here we have a few other optional things that we could pass into the body. And these are all things that we've set already for the assistant earlier. But if we want, we can choose to override them. So we can change the model, we can change the instructions, tools, etc. But since I'm quite happy with the assistant that we created, and I also don't want to potentially break something like pass in a model that isn't compatible with something else that we set up, like the retrieval, I am just going to leave everything as is. Okay, So let's go ahead and run our assistant. I'm going to need that thread ID, so let me copy that over from here. And awesome. So we got back this run ID, which we're going to need. And we have the instructions and everything. Most important is this status. Okay, so the status now is queued, which means that this assistant is ready to be run and it'll be run soon. And the difference here between assistants and chat completions is that the chat completion, when we get a response back, unless we're streaming, it indicates that we have completed the chat completion. So we get back our actual text with the response. Here, we just get back a response that indicates that we're working on it. Okay, so we got your request, we're working on it, and we have to do something called polling, which is to continue and check and see if our request has been completed and if we can retrieve the actual result of our run. So in order to do that, we're going to need this ID, this run ID right over here. And I'm going to grab that. Oh, I might need to copy the entire JSON. So let me copy that over. And I'm just going to grab just this run ID because that is what is important to me. And obviously this run ID will change every time you create a new run. So if you add a new user message and you create a new run, then there's going to be a different ID. So this is just really a one-time thing. And I'm going to get rid of all this because I don't need it. And basically we're going to need to create a function which continues to poll for that run and see if it's been completed or not. So here we can do that by retrieving the run. And if we head over here to this guide for the assistants, then we can learn a little bit more about the run lifecycle and what's happening in each stage after we create that run. And basically here we have a list of all the different statuses that could possibly come back when we run that retrieve run endpoint. So the first one is going to be queued, and then we have in progress, completed. And there are a few other ones here as well that well, except for requires action. So if you're using function calling, then it could be that after you make the initial run, the assistant will give you some information to make another completion of that run. And that's a little more complex and out of the scope of this initial tutorial, but that's what requires action is. And all the other ones have to do with things that we, I guess, hope won't happen, like expired, canceling, canceled, failed, etc. So we're really hoping to be somewhere within these three. Okay, so either queued, in progress, or completed. So if we run our retrieve function now, I'm imagining it will be completed. Let's check it out. So let's create a new function. So export async function, and this will be retrieve run. And what we're going to need here is the run ID. And then we're going to use this endpoint right over here. Sorry, that's retrieve run step. We just want this generic retrieve run. And I'm going to grab this right over here. And this will be our endpoint. So const endpoint. It's going to be a template literal. And so this here has the threads, thread ID, runs, run ID. So we're going to need also a thread ID here. Let's have a thread ID. And we'll pass this in. And then this will be thread ID. And this will be run ID. So it's interesting that we need the thread ID over here. And to me, that hints that a run is more associated with a thread than with a specific assistant. So a thread has runs under it, and assistants are kind of like on the side just doing stuff. This is me kind of trying to like go into how OpenAI set this all up in the back end and like what the relationships are between things. But actually, you don't really need that deep understanding, I think, to get it up and running. So if that's confusing you, you can just ignore it. But basically we have our endpoint over here. And let's see what else we need to pass in here. And so this is a GET request, but otherwise we don't need anything else. Okay, so we can basically copy over this from our previous GET request. I'm gonna copy this over. And by the way, I see that there's a mistake here because I mean, it's not like a critical mistake because the function will still run, but we don't really need a body when we have a GET request, as I said. So we can just copy this over like this. And this should be enough to retrieve our run. So let's try and get our run that we just created earlier. So we're going to need our thread. Let me go ahead and run the function. So we have our thread ID, and I'm going to grab our run ID as well and put it right over here. And let's go ahead and click run. Oops, I think I ran it twice by accident. And so here we get back our run, and we can see here that it has been completed. Okay, and that makes sense because it's been a nice few minutes since we actually created that run. And if it hadn't been completed, then that would be a very long time. So yeah, but this, depending on when you make this call, it might not be completed. So basically what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a function which both creates a run and then starts polling until we get back the completed status. So let's do that. Let me head into the assistant and go all the way to the bottom. And let's create a new function. So export async function, and we can call it create and poll run. Okay, I might change that name later on, but basically the idea is that it'll run this function. So it'll create an assistant. It'll run the assistant on a thread, and then it will continue to retrieve the run until we get back the completed response. So we'll say here const run equals to await run assistant, and here we'll pass in a thread ID, which we'll need to get here from our params as well. And then what we'll do over here, we'll also need to pass in our assistant. No, the assistant ID, right? I made it generic. I forgot already. So that we don't need. But then once we have this run, we can say const run ID equals to run.id. And then we can poll for our run. So I'm going to do this inside of a while loop. So let's say let status equal to run dot, I think it's status. Let's double check. Yeah, run dot status. And then while status is not equal to completed, we're going to run whatever logic we have in here. So this will create a loop that will keep on running until the status becomes completed. You might also want to put some kind of like timeout on it. For example, let timeout equal to 0, and then say and timeout is smaller than 30, let's say. Okay, that will prevent the situation where this while loop will go on infinitely if we had some kind of issue. Let's say this status, this run came back with an error or something and we didn't have a status, and then we enter into a while loop, and then since status can never be completed, then eventually it's just an infinite loop. We don't want that kind of situation in our server. So you can create a timeout, and let's say, for example, here, timeout plus plus, and that way each time this runs, then this will increase, and if it runs 30 times and we still didn't get back our completed run, then we're gonna just give up and try again. So that's what this timeout will do here. And we'll also want to put in some kind of delay, and that's because we want to give it time in between each poll in order to actually process our request. So let's say we give it 1 second each time. And that way this thing will run for 30 seconds total. And if we don't get our response back in 30 seconds, then we just give up. And you can play around with this delay depending on how you see, like how long you see the runs are taking. So if you see the average run takes, let's say, a minute, then let's say give it a delay of 2 seconds or 3 seconds, etc. And in order to create this delay, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a promise. So const delay equals to new promise. And this will have a resolve and reject. And basically, we're going to set timeout. And this timeout will be, let's say, 1 second. And then we can resolve. Resolve. Okay, cool. So this delay, this will create a delay essentially of 1 second. Okay, and I could just run the delay here, like that. Okay, maybe I did this a little wrong. Let's see, const delay equals to, let's try that. That's I turned it into a function essentially that returns this promise. And that also gives us the option to, let's say, put in here milliseconds, turn this into milliseconds as well, and then pass that in here. So I can pass in the 1,000 like that, and that should create a delay of a second, okay? And that delay of a second will come after we poll. So let's create const run equals to await retrieve run, and here we're going to pass in the thread ID, and we're going to pass in the run ID. And let me make sure that that order is correct. Thread ID, run ID, yes. And once we get back that run, we're going to say that status equals to run dot status. And we can also console.log status. Okay, so we can essentially, if this run comes back with a status of completed, then we will assign that value of status to this value of status, and then our while loop will stop running. And then we can just here at the end return run, let's say. No, let's return, what do we want to return here? Let's return the run ID. Plans. I might change that later on, but that's for now. And now all we need to do is essentially, let's send another message to our AI. So let's go over here. And I know this is like very abstract because we don't have an interface yet, but let me copy over my thread ID here. And I'm going to create a new message. So let's create a message. Oh, good. I have the thread ID already. So I just need to change this to say, what is a pickle? I don't know. I just want to add a message. So let me just run that. And so we added a new message to our thread. And now I'm going to run our assistant again. So let me run this create and run poll function. And I'm going to pass in the thread ID. And let's hit run. And status in progress, status in progress, status in progress. And yeah, so status is still in progress for a while. Okay, so I guess that 1 second delay was not enough. So let's try and do that again with a slightly longer delay. So I'm going to change my delay here to 3 seconds. Let me go ahead and run that again. Progress, status complete. Okay, so it ran 3 times, and then we got status completed. Okay, so that's just an example of how the polling, kind of the creating the run and the polling works. And now that we have our completed run, what we can do is we can essentially retrieve our messages again. So we can list our messages. Let's go ahead and list our messages. And here we have a list, and you can see here that there are a bunch of messages. There are 5 because we have a user message, a message from the assistant probably, user message, and then 2 from the assistant because I did 2 runs in a row. So let's open this up. So this is, sorry, it's backwards. So this is the message from the user on the bottom, and then this is the one from the assistant. So let's go over here and open up the contents. I'm just a computer program. How can I assist you today, etc. Okay, so messages that we would expect. But basically, whenever we see that the run is complete, that's our, oh, here's the answer to my pickle question. So whenever we see that a run is complete, that is essentially the sign that we can go ahead and get our list of messages and display that to the user. So now that we have this kind of basic infrastructure set up in the back end, we can head back to our playground on the front end and start to implement a user interface for the user to actually interact with what we built. So here we are back on our playground front end page. And what we're going to do is we're going to need to start importing some of these functions from our assistant file in the back end. So we don't need this get completion anymore, but we do need a bunch of things from here, such as create thread. Let's copy that over here. And this is obviously from backend/assistant and not playground. And let's see what else we need. So we're going to need list messages. That's going to be an important one. We're going to need create message as well. And we're going to need create and pull run. In that order. So that's the order that, that's the order that we're going to be using this all in as well. So for create thread, what I'm going to do is that as soon as the user lands on this page, we are going to create a thread. And again, this playground is just for creating Q&A, so like one question, one answer. So it's a little different than a conversation. So we don't have a real need for the thread except for the necessity of creating it for OpenAI's sake. But the thread is going to be a lot more obvious in terms of its functionality once we head over to the chatbot and start implementing over there. But we're still going to need to create that thread. So I'm going to do that over here. So let me just say let thread ID. And then here when in the onReady, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say const thread ID equals to await create thread. Yeah, and I can just change this onReady to an asynchronous function so we don't run into any issues there. Okay, and once we have this thread ID, we'll assign it to the variable up here. Okay, and now we have a global thread ID that we can use with all our other functions. So now here when we have ask question, okay, so what we're going to want to do is instead of running get chat completion, what we're going to want to do is run create message, and we're going to pass in some information here. What are we going to pass in? So we need to pass in thread ID and content, where again, content is going to be just whatever the user is saying, the input itself. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pass in thread ID, which we have stored as a global variable, and I'm going to pass in content, which can essentially just be the same here as this prompt, okay, which is the value of the user input. So let me just grab that and put that right over there. So I'm going to put prompt, and we can get rid of this messages array because now we're in the assistant and we've graduated to assistant and we don't need that anymore. So this is going to create the message, but it doesn't end here because we're not going to actually get the messages back after we create the message. So after we get this message response back, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to run our assistant. So we're going to want to say const create and, we're going to want to say const run ID equals to await, create, and poll run. And here we're going to pass in a few things again. So let's double check and see what that is. So we just need our thread ID. Okay, very convenient. So let me just pass in the thread ID over here. And once we have this run ID back, that means that our run has completed and we can list the messages from the. So we're going to say here const list, say message list, and that's going to be equal to await list messages, which needs to take a parameter of thread ID. Thread ID is very, very popular here with the functions that we created. And once we get this message list back, then we can display the last message, which is essentially going to be the first message in the current order that we're getting them back. So we're going to say const AI message equals to message list 0. And let's see, I forgot how that looks exactly. Let's see if we can find it here. Messages, list messages. Okay, so we get back data, which is an array. So we're going to want data, 0, content, text, value. Okay, let's see if I can remember that by heart. So it's message list, sorry, here on the front end, message list dot data, 0 dot content dot text dot value. I think that's what it was. If not, we'll figure that out very soon. And then once we get the message back, okay, then we're going to say that this message should be equal to the AI content. So this we don't need anymore here. And we can just say that, whoops, AI message is what we're going to assign to this AI content here. I could also call it AI content just for naming purposes to make it cleaner. Awesome. Okay, so I think that that should do it. So let's go ahead and try it out. I'm going to go and publish this. And let's go to our live site. And we're going to go to the playground. Playground. And let's try and test out our assistant. So I'm going to say, and remember here that our assistant was not built to tell you what our pickles are, but it was built in order to read that data from the Wix reports that I uploaded. So let's say summarize the financial reports. Let's try something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and click send. So this is my message here, summarize the financial reports. Let me go ahead and click inspect. See if we're getting any errors here. Okay, so we got a status code 504, which just means that we had a timeout between the front end and back end of Wix. So I just want to open up here my dashboard. Let's see, dashboard, and I want to see if we have any logs that indicate any kind of error in the back end of our code. So let me open up the logs here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. And let's try running that one more time. So I'm just going to go and refresh here. Same question. Okay, so we're getting back the status and it's null every time. So that is likely why we have an issue here. Okay, awesome. So we do have some kind of problem at the back end. And let's see what that is. So I'm going to go over my assistant, and the status was coming back as null. And okay, so run assistant thread ID. Let's add in a log here, and we'll have here run and run. And let's check out some of the other functions that we're running as well. So let's have here, let me also log on the front end. I want to make sure that we're actually getting this thread ID. So let's say console.log thread ID. That seems like a good place to start. So let me just publish that. And let's do a nice refresh here. I'm gonna paste that right over there and run. Okay, so I'm seeing here that I don't see the thread ID being logged. Let me just try doing one more refresh here. Ah, there's my mistake. Okay, so thread ID, I actually got back the entire thread and not the ID. Got it. That is my mistake. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say thread equals to const thread equals to create thread, and thread ID will be equal to thread.id. So equals sign. Okay, awesome. That was probably the issue. So let's try that one more time. And I'm going to clear my logs here. Let me refresh. Erase my log. Yeah. And let's try this one more time. Let's see if it's, I see in progress. That's already a good sign. I feel like it's not actually waiting. I feel like my delay might not be working. Because these, if I take a look at these, I see that they seem to be less than 1 second apart. So I feel like my delay is not really very successful. Let me check here. Ah, oops. Okay, so when I'm calling the delay, I need to have a wait here because otherwise we're not actually waiting for the promise to resolve, but we're just running this function and we don't really care what the result is. So for this delay to actually work, you need to have the await keyword here. So I really hope that you are actually watching the entire tutorial because if not, you will be very confused when you watch this part earlier and it's not working for you. But here, yeah, so this wants to take the await keyword and we'll publish that. And let's try running this again. Here are our logs. Third time's the charm. Okay, so now it's really rating 3 seconds in between each thing, in between each checking of the status. And this is also a great time to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you want. And yeah, so this is actually taking a while. I wonder how this compares to a chat completion. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 21 seconds, 28 seconds. Can I pause and come back? If you really want to keep me company, you can keep on watching. Let's see. Completed. Okay, awesome. So it took 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 13 times 8, 39 seconds, somewhere between 39 and 42 seconds. Okay, so that's, okay, it's not so bad. But the issue is that the Wix timeout between the front end and the back end happened over here. And that's why we still don't have a response here. So basically what we're going to need to do is to employ, so there's two approaches that we can take here actually. One approach is that we can employ Wix real-time, which can, oh, somebody else is using the website now. Thank you for whoever's visiting and trying out the demo website. That's very funny. So basically what we can do, let me head back over to the editor. So basically what we can do here is one of two things. So we can either set up Wix real-time and do this poll here on the back end, and whenever we actually get back the completed status, we can send a real-time message to the front end to indicate that that has worked. Another option is that we can actually have this create poll and run function on the front end. And that really helps us kind of utilize all the tools that we have at our disposal, and not need to use Wix real-time for this potentially. So I'm going to try that. For those of you who want to try the real-time option, I have another video explaining how to set that up. You can just search like 504 error on the channel and you should find that video. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and use this function on the front end because there's really no reason that we can't. So let me copy that over and I'm going to paste this function right over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to import, instead of create and poll run here, I'm going to import run assistant. And I'm going to import retrieve assistant, which I probably spelled wrong. Let's see. I probably spelled it wrong here too. Retrieve. My spelling is so bad. Retrieve run. Let's change it here as well. Right? That's how you spell retrieve. Okay, and we're going to need this delay function here as well. Oops. Let's change that there. We're going to need this delay function as well, so let me copy that over. Is that under here? And yeah, then this should continue to run just like before. So let's try this out now with this new operation. And I'm going to copy this over and give it a refresh. Clear this. And try this again. Let me make sure that published. And here we can see the status now on the front end as well. So basically we're doing the polling just from the front end. And there really is no disadvantage. Is there any disadvantage that I can think of doing it this way? I don't think that there is. It actually kind of helps deal with the issue of the responses just taking a very long time from OpenAI, which makes sense. They're doing a lot of complicated stuff there in the back end. Let's see, 9, 10. How many times did it take last time? 12? Let's see. 15. Should be getting that answer soon. Bear with me. Okay, so now it's completed. Now we're running that get. Oh no. Okay, cannot read undefined, getting value. Okay, that's because I was lazy here. Let's see. So we have here data, type, data, content, text, value. Let's see. What did I write here? Data, content, text, value. Let's see what comes back. Let's do console.log message list. And you can feel free to I won't be insulted if you skip forward like a minute in the tutorial, because that's probably how long it's going to take to debug this. But if you want to see the behind the scenes, then stay with me. Give this a refresh. And yeah, because I actually want to see what's inside of that list messages return. I'd actually just run list messages in the back end. It actually makes more sense. Message list. Okay, so let's see here. It came back a lot quicker this time. Okay, so we have two messages here. And this is data, content, text, value. Message list, data, 0, text, value. Not read the properties of undefined, reading value. Data, 0, content, text, value. What am I missing here? I'm sure some of you are like screaming at the screen because it's so obvious. Let's see. Oh, content. Ah, content is an array. Content is an array. Okay, so content 0. Content 0. And to be honest, by putting this content 0 here, I'm kind of hard coding something. So we should probably, like in a real situation, like when we create our chatbot, let's say, so we'll probably want to check if this content, like for each item in this content array, we'll probably want to display a message. Like, I don't know what situations necessarily there may be more than one bit of content. That's an interesting question, but we would want to prepare for that situation and not only display content 0, because then we might be missing out on some important information that the assistant is providing. But since this is just the playground and we want to get it working, I'm going to 0 here. So let me go ahead and run that. Sorry, publish the site. And I'm going to refresh. And I'm going to paste this right over here and send that again. Status in progress. This is probably going to take about 30 seconds, so this is a good chance to like the video if you're enjoying so far, comment if you have any questions, and subscribe to the channel if you want to see the rest of this series and other Velo-related, Wix-related content. You can also take a sip of your coffee, check your messages, um, maybe hop on Facebook briefly, just for a second. And completed. And we have messages. Okay, great. So we can see here the response, and that's fair that it took so long because it's kind of long. But here you can see essentially a comparison, a summary of the financial reports, and it's very obviously using the actual reports that I provided to the assistant through the OpenAI interface. So that wraps up our demonstration of a playground implementation, so a simple Q&A. And now we're going to hop over to the chatbot and see how we can build an entire chatbot experience around the Assistants API. So here I am on the Assistant page, and this is essentially a copy of the chatbot that we've been working on until now, with a few slight adjustments. One key adjustment is that we've removed all of the image generating capabilities And the other is that we've removed the audio generating capabilities. So basically, it is just stripped down to pretty much a snapshot of where we were after the first chat completions refresher tutorial. So we have a repeater with kind of the text boxes for displaying the assistant and user messages. And I've stripped down the code as well to really just the text related functions, but we're going to need to make a few changes here to make this work with the assistant. So let me go over here and zoom in a bit and zoom in one more, let's say. Awesome. So let's start off like we did before with importing all of the functions that we're going to need. So I'm going to go ahead and import, and we're going to need a few of these functions. So let's go and import create thread, and we will import list messages, and we're going to need create message as well. And we're going to need our run assistant, and we're going to need the retrieve assistant function. Okay, so we're going to do the polling in the front end as well, like we did in the playground. So this is going to be from backend/assistant. And I'm going to copy over our polling function as well. So let me just copy this over along with our delay function and put that right over here on the bottom under all our other functions. Okay, so now that we've done all of the imports, we can start to integrate this with our existing code. So if we go over here, we see we have a send message function, which is responsible for sending the message. And this is where we're going to implement most of the functionality. So once we get the user input, instead of getting a chatbot response using get chatbot response, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to send the message. So const, let's say message equals to await create message. Okay, put that right over here, create message. And we're going to need to pass in the thread ID here. So just like we did in the playground, we are going to want to say let thread ID. And we're going to want to generate that thread ID right over here. So const thread equals to await create thread. And here we're going to say thread ID equals to thread dot ID. So basically what we did last time, and we'll turn this into an asynchronous function so that this await can sit there. Awesome, so now that we have that set up, we can pass in a thread ID here to create message. And once we have created this message, the next thing that we're going to want to do is we are going to want to run our assistant. So we can essentially run this create and pull run function. So let's say await create and pull run. And here we're going to have thread ID as well. And here technically we don't really need to wait for a response from this because we don't actually need the value of the message unless we decide that we want to log that message within our repeater. So if we want to log a message in our repeater as soon as the user sends it, which makes a lot of sense, then we'll want to do that at this stage after we create the message. So after we create the message, for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this log message over here. And this is going to have, let me just do a refresher. So this is going to do messages.push message. So that means that we need to have, we basically need to convert between the assistant format and the chat completions format for messages. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say const, let's have it create message. So let's have this as created message. And then here we'll just have message equals to, and this is going to be an object. So the role is going to be user. And the message itself is going to be the content that we sent in, which I forgot to pass here into the create message anyway. So I'm happy that I caught myself with that. So that's user input. And the message itself is also going to be the user input, but we can get it here from the created message. So if we go over here to our API reference, we have create message, then this should return content, and then here we have text and value. And again, this is because I'm guessing that the user can provide multiple. I'm still not 100% clear on why these contents are arrays. That might be an interesting thing to research later on. But essentially, it's going to be content, 0, text, value. So let's tap into that. So I'm going to go over here, and here we're going to have the content, which is going to be the created message dot created message dot content 0 dot text dot value. Okay, and that message we're going to log here in log message. And then here, after we create and run poll, okay, create and poll run, okay, they could go both ways. Then we know that we want to retrieve our list of messages. So we're going to say const message list equals to await list messages, and we're going to pass in the thread ID. And then once we get this message list, so we can handle this in a few ways. Either we can just get the assistant message off of the top, assuming that the assistant is only going to send us one message, and log that message as a chatbot response. That's one option. The other option would be to get the entire list of messages and use that to display our repeater. Okay, so use the actual list that comes back. And I think that that is a generally better approach, more scalable, and even if with how Assistant is currently built, it doesn't have huge implications. Depending on how this tool develops in the future, it would be better to use the native list of messages to populate the repeater directly than to try and pick and select individual things from it. So in order to do that, we're going to need to take our message list and we're going to need to map it into a format that our messages repeater can understand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that message list and I'm going to say const formatted message list. Another option here would be to change how our repeater behaves based on how a message list is structured for the Assistants API. Either way can work. So the formatted message list is going to be message list dot map. And for each message, what we're going to do is we're going to want to return an object with the role and the content. So here we're going to have role and we're going to have content. And let's see how we can get each one of those things from our API. Let's see. So we get the list messages. So the role is just part of data. So that's going to be, so here we're actually going to want to map .data. And this is going to be the role is going to be message.role. And the data and the content is going to be like we tried to find it before. So it's content 0 text value. So message dot content 0 dot text dot value. And then once we get that formatted message list, then we're going to pass that to our repeater as data. In order to do that, we're going to need to create a random ID for each one of these items. So this populate messages repeater. So what we could do here essentially is we could just essentially do something like this. So we could say messages equals to formatted message list. And then here we can do populate messages repeater. One more thing that I want to do here is I want to also create a loading message. So here I'm going to log a message, and that message is just going to be role assistant, and content doesn't matter, but it's going to be, how did I set it here? How did we do the loading animation? If role needs to be loading. Sorry, so there's role loading. Doing a refresher here of how I set it up. So here role is going to be loading, and that should ensure the fact that we still have those kind of 3 dots showing when it's loading. So let's see how this works. Again, it's not 100% perfect. I think there will still need to be some alterations here to get it to work, but we've done enough coding to warrant some testing. So let me go ahead and publish that. And I'm going to head over to the site. So view publish site. And let me go to assistant. That's not the name of the page. Let me see what the name of the page is here. Settings. Probably forgot to change it from like blank 1 or something like that. Home 1. Yeah, and now I can't change it anymore. So let's just use home 1 for now. Home 1. Awesome. So now I'm going to say, hi, how are you? Do like a pulse check, see if that works. Okay, so we see the user message, which is good. And if we go and inspect, see if we started polling yet. Good, so we're in progress, complete. Awesome. So we got the answer here. So I'm noticing a few things. So let's see. For some reason, I still see this loading here, which is not so ideal. And the order is flipped. And that's because in the backend, I have it as descending, but I guess it should be ascending. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip it on the front end. So I'm just going to run array.reverse on the messages. Let's just try one more and see how this looks. So is this working? Okay, cool. Let's status complete. Yeah. Okay, so let's try first flipping it around as a first step. So I'm going to just do, I'm going to do here message list. So I'm going to just do here message list dot reverse. And that should flip it around. I think that creates, I don't remember if that creates a copy or not. We're going to find out in a moment. And now let's see if I can figure out why that loading is still showing. So I push that in, but then this should overwrite the entire array. Let me see. Populate message repeater. Yeah, I'm not sure why that loading is still showing. Let's see if I can identify why that is. How are you?
in reverse. Let's see, array dot reverse. We need to get, so it does in place and returns the reference to the same array. The first array element now becomes the last. Into one. Try loading this again. Yeah, that's not working. Zero basics. We did change it. Let's see if that works. I thought that wasn't possible to change, but I guess I'm wrong. Okay, there we go. Awesome. That's the new URL. Hi, how are you? And let's see, so status in progress, status completed. Reverse is not a function. Is it not? Oh, I know what I did wrong. So basically, this message list is not an array. The formatted list, this one is. So this needs to go here. Dot reverse needs to go over here. Let me go ahead and publish that. Let's do a hard refresh over here. How are you? Yeah, luckily these interactions are a bit shorter, so than summarizing 4 PDF documents. So at least we have a shorter loading time, which is nice. I guess it's a refresh. And then, how are you? And in progress. And completed. And awesome. Okay, so when it's reversed so that we don't have that issue with the loading, I'm curious as to why exactly it was happening, but now it seems to be working correctly. It doesn't have feelings, so let's ask for something from our documents now. So um, in which quarter did Wix make more money? And this, I'm assuming, is going to take a little more time for it to retrieve. Oh, status complete. That was pretty quick. Wix made more money in the second quarter of 2023. Awesome. Good for you, Wix. Um, how much did it make in the first quarter? That's actually information that I did not provide through the PDF, so I'm very curious to see how it's going to answer that, because I only gave it the second quarter and the third quarter. In the first quarter, okay, so it just hallucinated. Unless maybe one of the other documents did mention the first quarter as well, so that is definitely a possibility. But yeah, so that's kind of a demonstration of how to take the assistant and then put it into a chatbot-like format. Again, there are different approaches to this. I went with what was easiest for us because we already built an entire chatbot and logic with which kind of the chatbot repeater populates. So it was easiest for me just to kind of like put small alteration on the list of messages to combine it with what we've done already. But if you're building your chatbot completely from scratch, then you might want to build your repeater logic based on the assistant logic. And that would also prevent you from doing stuff like hard coding this content 0. So for example, you might want to, within each one of these messages, extract all of the content and then convert that into messages. You could probably also do that with the way that we did it. But I'm going to wrap up here. I think that I've given you enough to get started with the new OpenAI Assistant API. And I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.